So want to welcome everyone again this morning to our webinar. Our presenter this morning is Cara Napolitano. She is the Research and Training Manager for the Laboratory to Combat Human Trafficking. So thank you for being here this morning, Cara. I'll let you take it away.
Cool. Thank you so much, Sierra and Kathy and everyone from CCASA. I'm honored to be here. I was just mentioning how much I respect the organization and the work that you all in the audience do. So really appreciate you taking the time to learn more about this intersection of human trafficking, sexual and intimate partner violence. I think for some of you, the intersection will be more obvious than for others. I think for folks who are new to this work, this may be introductory information in the beginning of the presentation, and then I hope to leave you with as many resources and just kind of deeper dives into different considerations that you might not have had before. And I'll provide you with as many additional links and resources as I can via my presentation, which will be offered to you as the slide deck will be offered to you at the end of the presentation as well. So you don't have to be taking screenshots or anything like that. My name is Cara, as Sierra said. I use she, her pronouns, and I work for an organization called the Laboratory to Combat Human Trafficking, and we are Denver-based, but a statewide organization. And I travel around the state in my role as a training manager, training organizations like the ones that many of you work for, as well as law enforcement agencies, healthcare providers, and folks working in substance misuse, folks working in other homelessness or housing insecurity. People who are likely seeing this, but might not be trained to recognize it. And so each one of our presentations is modified and tailored to the audience. So today, what I want to discuss is this specific intersection. But before I get there, I want to talk about, what human trafficking is, make sure we're on the same page about what human trafficking really is, because there is so much misinformation out there, and really an over focus on domestic minor sex trafficking, usually of female identified survivors. That's what we see in the news. That's what we see in movies, like the movie Taken, which is like the bane of my existence because it presents such a not accurate picture of what human trafficking really looks like here in the US. So first, we'll start with kind of like a 101 about what human trafficking is, with an emphasis on this intersection of interpersonal and sexual violence. And then in the second half of the presentation, we'll really dive into some additional resources for you. As I saw in the poll, about half of you are advocates and a lot of you are working at these specific intersections. And so we don't expect you to be human trafficking specialists. We don't expect you to know all the resources that are out there. So we want you to be able to plug into those pretty readily. And that's what I hope to present to you today. So I'm going to get us started with a short video, actually, and then we'll move forward.
My trafficker was my husband. There was no way I could reach out to anybody for help.
We're scared. We're scared to run. We're scared to tell anybody what's going on.
It was an incredibly violent situation. I felt like there was no way I could get out.
Human traffickers can be just about anyone from any walk of life. A lot of the trafficking involves domestic servitude, hoteliers, restaurant owners, owners of massage parlors, agricultural farm owners.
It can be a trafficker who tells a woman, I want to be your boyfriend, I love you, and if you love me, you're going to go out and have sex for money. It can be kind of psychological like that, or it can be more overt and more physical. It can be hitting, abusing, keeping them away from any support systems.
Trafficking, it doesn't know any boundaries. The victim can be male, female, transgendered, anyone. And it happens all over America.
I still see this attitude of it's just immigrants or it's just people in other countries. It happens to US citizens so much more than people are aware.
The natural stakeholders in this issue are certainly law enforcement, legal advocates, social service providers. There's other players involved as well.
It is important to engage the community because victims often don't self-identify. They don't come forward to law enforcement.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Citizens in the community are the eyes and the ears.
It's medical workers, it's educators, it's personnel at homeless shelters.
We can't do this alone. No one has the capacity to provide every single thing that a victim or survivor of human trafficking needs.
There has to be a support system within the community, psychological counseling, shelter, and vocational education so they can reintegrate, become a healthy individual.
There's an intentional effort to get everyone together so we know how to share resources, we know how to work together, and to make sure at the end of the day, a victim becomes a survivor.
Okay, so, kind of the idea behind that video, I hope is pretty obvious. I really wanted to show the diversity of lived experience. We tend to focus on, as I said at the beginning, female survivors of sex trafficking only. And you will see all genders, you will see all types of trafficking, including both labor and sex. You'll sometimes see people being trafficked for both. This, as was said in the video, knows no boundaries. People are generally trafficked by someone that they know, and usually someone that they know and love. About 30% of traffickers are a family member of the victim, usually a parent or guardian or someone else in a position of power. That's 30% of cases. About 40% of cases are perpetrated by an intimate partner. That's 40% of cases, right? And that's 70% total. So family member or intimate partner. And so those overlaps with domestic violence and sex assault, I think, are pretty obvious when you think of it that way. Another 25% of perpetrators are someone else in a position of power, an employer, a teacher, a coach, religious authority, someone who can leverage the vulnerabilities of the victims, their knowledge of the vulnerabilities of the victims. And when I say leverage, what I mean is try to meet their needs better than what's being done already. So if someone's experiencing homelessness, a trafficker might offer housing. If someone is looking for love, a trafficker might offer love. If someone is looking for work, a trafficker would offer work, right? So this kind of notion of kidnapping, the scary stranger at the Target parking lot who's marked you as vulnerable for some reason, it's simply not true. Is it possible that someone could be kidnapped into a situation? Sure, it is possible, but it happens less than 5% of the time. Most of the time, people are trafficked by someone that they know, and often someone that they know and love. I want to give you a big picture idea of what trafficking looks like, the scope of it, around the world and here in Colorado. So the International Labor Organization puts out our best estimates of what human trafficking, what the scope of human trafficking is around the world every year. They just put out their estimates in September of 2022. They currently estimate that around 50 million people are being trafficked on any given day. 50 million. Only 54% of that 50 million are female. So it's about 50-50 when it comes to gender. Individuals who are trans or outside of the binary of genders are disproportionately represented in survivor populations, which is true of all forms of violence, right? So we've got a lot of female, we've got a lot of male, and we've got trans individuals who are disproportionately represented. only about 25% of victims are minors. So this notion that they're all young and they're all snatched off the street and it's all for sex trafficking, again, simply untrue. Of the 50 million people being trafficked in the world, about 3 times as many people are trafficked for labor than for sex. That's true the world over. That's true here in Colorado as well. So sort of dispelling some of these myths, I hope, will raise your awareness of how this is showing up in your work. Because people know what domestic violence is. They know what interpersonal violence is. They know what sexual assault is. These are things that, because of advocates and survivors over the last couple of decades, really few decades, have brought to our attention, have brought to our awareness, have spoken out about. People understand what domestic violence, interpersonal violence, and sexual assault are. But most people don't understand what human trafficking is. We're still, depending on things like the movie Taken and viral social media posts for our education on this issue, unfortunately. And that leads to a lot of fear, I think. And that includes for advocates who are working in interpersonal violence or sex assault, because they're just normal people too. You all are just people who are exposed to the same things as the rest of us are exposed to. And if you're basing your notion of what human trafficking is on the movies, then I get why you're scared. But what I really want to get across today, what I hope that you take away from this conversation today, is that if you are already working at the intersection of, or working in interpersonal violence or sex assault or any of these sort of intersecting lived experiences, then you already are seeing this, and you already have a lot of the tools that you need to support survivors. Okay. So what is human trafficking? The definition that you're seeing on your screen now says that it's a severe form of exploitation for labor, including sex as a form of labor, through the use of force, fraud, or coercion. So trafficking is a human or a group of humans that is forcing another person into work that they don't want to do through the means of physical force, fraudulent promises, or coercive tactics for the financial benefit of the trafficker, right? So it's a severe form of exploitation for labor, including sex as a form of labor, through the use of force, fraud, or coercion. So we're talking about agriculture, construction, prostitution, all of these are forms of labor, okay? So that's like the most basic definition I can give you. For it to be trafficking, there has to be a commercial component. Someone is profiting off of the labor or the sex work. And there has to be these means of force or fraud or coercion being used to force someone into these situations. Okay, so here in the US, we defined it a little bit differently. We sort of parsed out the definition into 3 subcategories. Now, as I'm talking through this federal definition here, this is the TVPA, the Trafficking Victims Protection Act. You don't necessarily need to know this. What you need to know is in the federal law, as well as in the Colorado law, there are 3 categories of trafficking. We parsed out sex trafficking from labor trafficking into 2 separate categories. However, they are both class 3 felonies. And then we made a 3rd category for minor sex trafficking. That's a class 2 felony. In the minor sex trafficking category, we actually got rid of the need or the requirement that there be force or fraud or coercion. So I'm going to talk through several examples of trafficking that we've seen here in Colorado on this slide. As you think through the nuances, think through the people that you've served in the past, the stories that they've told you, and see if you can start to realize or recognize potential situations of trafficking with clients you've worked with in the past. So we manage the statewide human trafficking hotline at LCHT, at the Laboratory to Combat Human Trafficking. I think that it's important for you to hear the stories that we hear on the hotline. Of course, I'm going to tell you them in a de-identified way, but these are all real stories. So for minor sex trafficking, without there being the requirement for force, fraud, or coercion, it can get a little bit confusing. So what we're saying here is any minor under the age of 18 who's engaged in any form of commercial sex is by definition a victim of trafficking. So that's regardless of whether or not someone is forcing or frauding or coercing them into it. Because we've decided as a society that kids cannot consent to commercial sex. So even when they say they're consenting, they cannot legally consent, right? So I'm going to give you two examples of child sex trafficking that are very different, but both meet the standard. So we had a case with the 8-year-old boy who was being trafficked by his parents. As I said, 30% of trafficking cases are perpetrated by a parent or guardian. So he was being sold for sex. This was a number of years ago, and it was happening mostly via Facebook Messenger and Craigslist at the time. He was going to school during the day. He wasn't locked up. He was walking among us. He did well in school. In fact, because I know him now as an adult, he liked school. It was his safe place. So he was going to school during the day, at night, and on the weekends, he was being sold for sex by his parents. It was happening in his home. Sometimes he was brought to hotels and motels, but all, again, within a few miles of his home. He was sometimes brought to events, like brought to football games or the Western Stock Show and sold in bathrooms. This case is egregious and not nice to hear about, but an obvious case of child sex trafficking, right? No 8-year-old kid is willingly engaging in commercial sex, and you've got obvious perpetrators, the parents in this case, right? We can wrap our heads around this case pretty easily. Now, in some other of these cases, it's much more difficult to recognize. So I'll give you another example. So say you've got like a 17-year-old female who's run away from home, and she's run away from home for a really good reason. In her home, she was experiencing sexual and domestic violence. She was being sexually assaulted by her father. She was witnessing domestic violence on her family, and she was sick of it. She was older now, she had more autonomy, and even though she'd run away many times in the past, she'd been returned to her home. So this time when she ran away, she was absolutely determined not to be sent back. So she ran away and she's on the street, and she's purposefully not asking for help. Like, she's not engaging in systems. She's not going to homeless shelters. She's not asking law enforcement for help because she doesn't want to be returned home. She figures out pretty quickly that she can trade sex to meet her survival needs. So 17-year-old kid living on the street, trying to figure out how to get enough food to eat, places, shelter for her because she was in Colorado and it was cold. And she figures out that she can trade sex to meet those needs. Now that 17-year-old is also a victim of child sex trafficking. Because again, we got rid of the requirement for there to be force, fraud, or coercion. What we've decided as a society is kids cannot consent to commercial sex. So this 17-year-old, even though she thinks she's engaging in prostitution and she's doing it willingly, isn't. She is in fact a victim of human trafficking. She cannot be arrested for the crime of prostitution, and by legal standards, she must be treated as a victim. Now, commercial sex means trading anything of value for any sex act. So it doesn't have to be money, it could be money, but it could also be a bus ticket, a place to stay for the night, food, drugs. Trading anything of value for any sex act, including the act of prostitution, but also pornography, webcamming, stripping, makes it commercial. And any kid who's engaging in commercial sex is a victim of trafficking, regardless of how they self-identify. So that 17-year-old didn't say to anyone, I'm a victim of trafficking, right? She didn't know. She hadn't had a human trafficking 101. She thought she could get arrested for the crime of prostitution because she knows it's illegal. And she thought that if she told anyone what she was doing, then she would be judged and stigmatized. And honestly, she could have been right about that, right? We tend to not like people in our society. I'm not talking about anyone on this call in particular, but as a society, we generally don't like it when people are engaging in commercial sex. We've criminalized it and we've stigmatized it. So not only would she be avoiding resources, avoiding shelters, but she was also lying to anyone who asked her if she was okay, right? Or who was trying to help her. So a lot of these situations are much more nuanced than we think. Most people do not self-identify as having experienced trafficking. Now that 17-year-old doing what she's doing is likely to eventually meet somebody who wants to be her manager, right? Who wants to utilize the youth and the lack of experience of this individual and the trauma history of this individual to make money off of them. She's putting herself in a situation where she's likely to meet somebody who wants to take advantage of her in this way. So people who are willingly engaging in sex work are often in positions where they meet somebody who then becomes their manager or their pimp, who then continues to sell them for sex against their will, but usually purports to be someone who's in love with them, right? Their new boyfriend, their new partner in whatever way, right? So the second category here, for those who are 18 or over engaging in commercial sex, there does have to be force, fraud, or coercion. So this is where we acknowledge choice. Plenty of people do willingly engage in commercial sex, but for it to be human trafficking, someone has to be forced or frauded or coerced into the situation. Now that may seem cut and dry, either they're choosing it or they're not, but it's usually much more nuanced than we think. So I'll give you another example. We had an 18-year-old, so legally an adult, who had a 1-year-old baby, and she was trying to figure out childcare. She couldn't afford childcare, just like most people in Colorado, and she had a mom who would help her. So she lived with her mom. Mom worked during the day, and mom said, "I'll watch your kid at night if you get a night job." So she did. She started as a server. She got other night jobs, but they weren't paying enough. She eventually started stripping. This was pre-pandemic. She liked it. She was making great money. She was having fun. She got to spend days with her kid. One night, after having worked there for a couple of months willingly, right, as a willing sex worker, as a stripper, she was approached by her boss, who said, "I've got a client downstairs who just gave me $200 to have sex with you. I want you to go do it." And she says, "No, that's not what I signed up for." So the boss shuts the door, beats her up, and tells her if she doesn't, she's fired. So she's terrified. She's an 18-year-old kid who's just been physically assaulted by a grown man who's just threatened her with her job. So she did it. And he gave her $50. So she thinks she's just engaged in prostitution. She thinks she's going to get arrested for that crime, when in fact, she's just been trafficked. She's been physically assaulted and coerced through the threat of losing her job into a commercial sex act that she didn't want to do for the financial benefit of somebody else, her boss in this case. But she doesn't know it, right? She knows it's not good what just happened to her, but she doesn't realize that it's trafficking. Because again, people are basing their definition on the movie Trafficking. She wasn't, or the movie Taken. She wasn't locked up in a basement. She wasn't injected with drugs. She wasn't kidnapped. She was allowed to go leave, right? But she still wasn't self-identifying that way. So that's what I really want you to understand about these nuances. People know what domestic violence is. They know what interpersonal violence is. They know what sexual violence is. They're going to show up saying, "I've been assaulted," right? "My partner has hurt me." But they're not going to say, "I've been trafficked," because they simply don't know what trafficking is. Now, this third category here is forced labor. This is the one that we never hear about. And it may be the one that you think isn't relevant to your work, but I promise you that it is. Because people who've experienced prior trauma, people who are being controlled by an intimate partner, people who are being trafficked by their employer are incredibly vulnerable to labor trafficking, right? The way that we see labor trafficking showing up in Colorado is twofold. So we see it happening in the regular economy, the formal economy, in positions like with low wages, high turnover, high immigrant populations, high young people, seasonal work. So things like agriculture, ranching, anywhere where migrant farm workers work, so meat packing plants or dairy farms or potato factories. We see it in construction, we see it in landscaping, we see a great deal of domestic servitude where people are forced to work as nannies or house cleaners while they live in someone else's home. That's a great deal of power, right, for someone to have. They control your housing, they can tell you whether or not you can come and go, they control everything that you do, really, in those situations. Domestic servitude is one of the more common forms of labor trafficking that we see in Colorado. We also see it in restaurants and hospitality, anywhere with cleaning crews, anywhere where we use subcontractors, which is often construction and cleaning crews. So that's the formal economy, these kinds of low wage, high turnover jobs. And then we also see it in the informal economy. We see people being forced to beg on the street, and then that money is collected by their trafficker. We often see this with populations who are mentally ill or who have disabling conditions, either visible or invisible. So people who are dependent on someone else for their survival, and that person is forcing them to beg. We also see people being forced to like shoplift or commit other crimes. Sometimes we see people being forced to sell drugs or mule carry drugs. And that's often because they have a debt to their drug dealer. So they're using substances, they've accumulated a debt to their drug dealer, who then says, now you owe me $3,000, here's how you're gonna work it off. You're gonna commit these crimes, you're gonna sell these drugs, you're gonna do this or that to pay me back, or else I'm gonna kill you, or else I'm gonna hurt your kids, or else I'm gonna report you to law enforcement. Forcing someone to commit a crime for the financial benefit of somebody else is another form of forced labor that we see intersecting with interpersonal violence or sexual violence often. And it's usually perpetrated, again, by someone that the victim knows, and often someone that the victim knows and loves. And nobody in any of these situations that I've mentioned so far would self-identify as a victim of trafficking. None of it fits into that common narrative. Now, this isn't limited to those who are foreign-born youth or females. This note on the bottom of the page here is just sort of a shout out to some of these myths and misconceptions. We tend to think of this as only happening to those who are foreign-born. And I will say that immigration status is often used as a form of coercion. So even though it's not only happening to individuals who are foreign-born, it is disproportionately affecting those individuals. Here in Colorado, of the cases that we're familiar with, like in other words, the ones who've been reported, about 60% of them are affecting foreign nationals. And that's because immigration status can be used as a form of coercion. So do this or I'll call ICE. Do this or I'll have your parents deported, right? Do this or I'll report you to law enforcement. So 60% of trafficking victims in Colorado are foreign nationals. That leaves 40% domestic. Again, we tend to think of this as happening to young females, and it does, but not the majority. You know, I want to get these images of like young, cute, crying girls locked up in a basement out of your heads. This is not what trafficking looks like. How we see trafficking show up is actually much different than that. So this next slide that you're looking at here, the action means purpose model, is another way to think through this definition. Now, I'm going to talk through a couple of additional scenarios here, but what I want you to take away from this slide is that there has to be one thing from each one of these categories present for it to be trafficking, but not all of them. So there has to be an action, a means, and a purpose listed here. Now, the purpose of trafficking is profit. This is an economic crime. It's hard to think about it that way because it's so egregious and so violent, but it is an economic crime. Someone is profiting off of the work of somebody else. So that's what often differentiates it from domestic violence or sexual violence. There has to be that commercial component. However, you can see how they would be happening simultaneously. And again, people are usually reporting the domestic violence and the sexual violence, but not the trafficking. So it's going to be up to us as advocates to be able to recognize those signs, those red flags, and then have those conversations with folks about the fact that the crimes that they're experiencing also include trafficking, and give them some options for what they want to do about that, how they want to move forward in their recovery. Now, the most common action is recruitment. Now, again, think about the fact that 70% of traffickers are either parents or guardians, other family members, or intimate partners. Traffickers are looking for vulnerability. 70 to 90% of trafficking survivors have experienced prior violence. 70 to 90%. So they're looking for vulnerabilities very similar to the vulnerabilities of all of the clients that you work with. Drug vulnerabilities, housing vulnerabilities, previous trauma, vulnerability and fear, poverty, lack of access to the formal economy, lack of ability to find jobs, a previous criminal record, which would make it harder to find housing or jobs. That's what traffickers are looking for. They're identifying people that are vulnerable and they're going after them in a targeted way. They're not looking for pretty people walking down the street. They're looking for somebody who may have fallen off the radar of their family, maybe ran away from home, or who left their home country to come to the US to find work and can't, or who is so afraid of and dependent upon them that they know they'll never leave. Right? So recruitment looks a lot more like, I'll give you a place to stay, or I've got work for you, or here are the drugs that you need, then it does look like kidnapping, okay? Then there's usually some kind of grooming process. Maybe it's days, maybe it's weeks, maybe it's months, some cases it's years, where the trafficker is then making the person completely dependent on them, right? Once I control your work and your housing and you're in love with me, where else are you gonna go, right? That's a lot of power for someone to have. Sometimes people are harbored, the next action on this list, that would be locked up, chained up somewhere. But, you know, just to be clear, they usually don't have to be, because people are being held in place with threats of violence against their family, threats of calling ICE, threats of exposure, losing their children, threats of homelessness, etc. But sometimes people are locked up. We see that happening in labor trafficking situations, like where everyone's living and working in a home, living in a home, and then they're being brought to and from the farm or brought to and from the restaurant, something like that. And then we also see people harbored temporarily in like hotels, motels, and increasingly in Airbnbs, where they're kind of tricked into going with someone to a hotel to maybe to party or do drugs, maybe for love. And then when they get there, they're told, you know, they're not going to be allowed to leave. They're usually kept high. They're not allowed to sleep. Food and water are withheld, and they're sold for sex against their will for multiple days at a time. Sometimes people are transported. That would be like transported to where the demand is. So I live up in a mountain rural community with a lot of ski resorts. People are brought up here from the Front Range to be sold for sex to tourists, or to clean tourists' hotel rooms or cook for them, right? So there's quite a demand for labor and sex where I live. People are brought up from the Front Range in that way, so transported. But don't ever forget that 8-year-old who was trafficked by his parents. People don't have to be transported for it to be trafficking. It's just sometimes the case. We also see people provided. That would be like, I provide access to my kid in exchange for rent. Maybe I'm 6 months behind on my rent. My landlord knows it. He knows I have kids and he's a pedophile, and he's come knocking on the door and saying, if you give me access to your kids for the day, I'll call it even on the 6 months rent or something like that. So provided, sometimes in exchange for drugs as well. Obtained is that snatched off the street narrative. I don't want to discount anyone's experience if they've been trafficked in this way, because it is possible that someone could be kidnapped into a trafficking experience. But I do want to say that it's highly uncommon. Most of the time, overwhelmingly, people know their trafficker, at least to some limited extent. Now, the means are through force, fraud, or coercion. I've already given you some examples of this. Force is, you know, being locked up or physical assault. Fraud are these like fraudulent promises, like I've got some great job for you, or I'll help you run away from this abusive household that you're from. I'll take care of you. I'm going to love you. Fraudulent promises of love, something like that. And then coercion, this incredibly powerful tool. Do this or else. Do this or I'll hurt your family. I'll have you deported. I'll make your 6-year-old sister do it. One other form of coercion I haven't mentioned yet is using video as a form of coercion. So I'll give you an example. We had a case with a Vietnamese nail salon, where the owner of the nail salon was Vietnamese. He was from Vietnam. He was a US citizen, and he was recruiting people from Vietnam to come work in his nail salon. He was offering them great jobs. He was saying that he would give them housing when they got here, and he was helping them get visas. So he wasn't bringing them in illegally through smuggling. He was bringing them in legally, offering them jobs. When they got here, they were then told they had a debt to him. They had to pay him back for the flight and the housing and everything else, which they hadn't been told before they got here. So they had this immediate debt. This person was a powerful person in their home country and in their village. And so they were terrified of him. And then he was, with this one girl anyway, he was sexually assaulting her, taking video of it, and then threatening to send the video back to her family in Vietnam if she didn't continue to work in the nail salon, basically as a slave without payment, paying off this assumed debt. So using sexual violence as a means of physical force to hold someone in place, and using the video of it as a coercive tactic. I'll send this video to your family if you don't stay. She wasn't being sex trafficked. She wasn't being sold for sex. She was being labor trafficked, but sexual violence was being used as a form of coercion and force, right? Now, the purpose here, again, is profit. So I'll give you one more example of this intersection that we've seen to help you to differentiate between these crimes. So we had a case of a 16-year-old girl who was living with her biological father. Mother was out of the picture and being abused, domestic violence. Lots of calls had been made to this house, including letting child welfare know that she was being assaulted, but she hadn't been taken out of the home yet. They hadn't been able to prove anything. She was too scared to disclose. One day, there was a particularly violent situation. A neighbor called the police, and the police were able to remove her from the house. So this was a pretty clear-cut case of child abuse, of domestic violence, of sex assault. But it wasn't until a forensic interview was done a couple of weeks later that the trafficking was uncovered, because the father was also allowing his friends to come into the house and trade him drugs and alcohol for access to his daughter. So she was being sold for sex as well, sold for the drugs and alcohol. Now, she didn't know she was being trafficked, but that fits the definition of it, right? Now, what the father ends up getting convicted of is going to depend on what they can prove and whatever plea deals they make, etc. But we know that that victim, that minor, was experiencing all of these forms of violence: child abuse, sex assault, domestic violence, and trafficking. So it matters to us as advocates to know this, so that we can get that kid the mental health resources that she needs to recover, and that so she can have access to all of the different resources that are out there that are trafficking specific. Now, it's going to be a journey of healing, but understanding the extent of the trauma that she's suffered and understanding all of the resources that are out there for her to pursue justice and recovery is really vital. So that's why we want to be able to differentiate between these crimes, not because one matters more than another, but because they're going to have additional needs based on the fact that they were being bought and sold, usually by someone that they know and love, as far as mental health resources and recovery, but also they're going to have access to additional resources in the acknowledgement of this additional crime. Okay, so people who end up being trafficked aren't stupid, they're not deviant. They're the same individuals that we're all supporting in our work, right? They're people who've experienced abuse or neglect. They're experiencing homelessness. They're experiencing poverty. They've got a disproportionate number of marginalized identities are reported in these crimes, right? This is true for all of the crimes that we're talking about here today. Someone is stepping in and saying, I got you, right? I'll give you the thing that you need, right? The things on the right side of the screen: love, family, a job, acceptance, right? These are all things that we're all looking for. The trafficker is providing those things for the victim. So they're not stupid for accepting it. They're being frauded, right? And what's challenging for us as advocates is that when we see these relationships, they sometimes appear consensual, right? The person seems to be with this person by choice. And to some extent they are, because they're meeting their needs. They're afraid to leave that person for fear of losing their love, losing their parents, losing their housing, losing their job, right? And so even though, what I want to note here is that even though some parts of these relationships are consensual in some cases, no one consents to being exploited, nor could they legally. No one consents to being bought and sold 16 times a day by their intimate partner. No one consents to working 19 hours in a field without food or water or breaks and no pay. No one consents to that, nor could they legally. So even when parts of the relationship are consensual, nobody's consenting to exploitation. Now, I've got child welfare on here because I want to note that kids in the child welfare system, and especially in the foster care system, are often targeted. In some studies, now there's gazillions of studies out there, but in some studies, it's something like 40 to 65% of kids who are trafficked or identified as trafficking survivors were in the foster care system. Now, I urge you to read this quote. I'll read it out loud for you. Being in foster care was a perfect training for commercial sexual exploitation. I was used to being moved without warning, without any say, not knowing where I was going or whether I was allowed to pack my clothes. After years in foster care, I didn't think anyone would want to take care of me unless they were paid. So when my pimp expected me to make money to support the family, it made sense to me, right? So kids in the foster care system are often targeted because of the violence that they've already experienced and the normalization in their lives of that violence. It's just something I wanted to note. It also resulted, these data resulted in the passage of a law here in Colorado that made child sex trafficking a form of child abuse. Therefore, if you are a mandatory reporter of child abuse, you should know that you are a mandatory reporter of child sex and child labor trafficking in the state of Colorado. Now, we modified the law in 2019 to include labor trafficking. So we defined child sex trafficking as a form of child abuse, regardless of who the perpetrator is. Prior to this law, it was only a form of child abuse if the perpetrator was the parent or guardian. Now it doesn't matter. Could be a pimp from up the street, a boyfriend, whomever. Any child who is a victim of child sex or labor trafficking, if you are a mandatory reporter of child abuse, you are a mandatory reporter of this crime. So I just wanted to make that very clear. Now, COVID made everything worse. I want to dive into some intersections that we see here. Yes.
Can you slow down a little bit, please?
Yes, sorry, I'm so sorry. I get carried away. Okay, I will slow down. Yes, so COVID made everything worse. I think I don't have to spend too much time on this concept because sexual assault and interpersonal violence advocates know this, right? There was an uptick of all crimes during the pandemic, especially crimes perpetrated by intimate partners, people who lived with their perpetrator. And as you know, this obviously affects trafficking as well. So there was additional risk during COVID as well. You know, people were losing their housing, they were losing their jobs. And so traffickers could step in and meet those needs or lie about being able to meet those needs for their victims. So we had a pretty significant uptick of trafficking during the pandemic. I want to mention here quickly that trafficking is happening in Colorado, but it's also happening everywhere else. We're talking about trafficking in Colorado because we're in Colorado, not because it only happens here. So I want you to remember that, trafficking is happening in rural communities, it's happening in urban communities, and it's happening in every single state. Each state has factors that contribute to the problem specifically. Most of these I've already mentioned. So we have a great deal of agriculture, ranching, we have a great deal of tourism, a huge construction, restaurants and hospitality industry here in Colorado. We've got I-25 and I-70 running clear across the country and meeting here in Colorado. But every state has highways. So it's not like these highways in particular or the meeting of these highways necessarily results in more trafficking, but it is somewhere where we see people being moved around. We've got marijuana grows in Colorado. We've seen a lot of folks labor trafficked on illegal marijuana grows in the state. We've got Denver International Airport. It's the only international airport within like a 450-mile radius or 550-mile radius. So people are brought into the state to be trafficked for labor and sex through DIA. Sadly, we've got a demand for sex with minors. People are willing to buy sex from kids. It's pretty common everywhere, including here in Colorado. Anyone who buys sex from a minor is engaging in trafficking. We've also got a demand for cheap products. So it's not just the demand for sex that drives this, it's also our own purchasing habits. So I want you to really think about where you buy your food, where you buy your clothing, where it comes from. I really encourage you to be conscious consumers. There are a great deal of products that are made, especially in other countries, but also here in the US that are likely being made by slave labor. Things like chocolate, shrimp from South Asia, anything with palm oil in it. We can talk more about that offline if anyone's interested in learning more. Okay, so I wanted to show you a little bit of data. I'm not going to spend too much time on data because it's so limited. So few people identify this, so few people report it so few people receive recourse. But these are some of the official numbers that we have. We've got an FBI task force. We've got the Colorado Human Trafficking Hotline. I've got some Denver specific case numbers here. The Department of Justice, the Colorado Department of Human Services had 325 referrals in 2021. HSI is Homeland Security Investigations. So just wanted to give you a picture of some of the fact that we do have many cases. I wanted to show you also these numbers. So in Colorado, we've got 6 organizations, and I'll tell you more about them in a minute, that receive federal funding to support survivors of human trafficking. Those 6 organizations also support victims of other crimes. But because they receive the federal funding that they do, they are required to keep data on how many victims of human trafficking they see. Most of you likely do not work for one of these organizations and therefore are not required to keep said data, but you're likely still seeing it, just not reporting on it, right? So these numbers on this page reflect the data from just these 6 organizations who are required to keep it. And these individuals do not overlap with those who were reported to law enforcement. These are individuals who were not interested in reporting to law enforcement, but still wanted to receive resources. Okay, so in order to identify this, first of all, we need to get these images out of our heads, right? The kinds of images that you see on your screen right now, the cute, young, innocent, usually white or Asian female who's being trafficked for sex. They're usually over-sexualized in these images. Now, I'm not saying that cute young girls aren't trafficked for sex, because they are. But the problem with this being our only narrative about this is that if this is the only thing we think trafficking looks like, then it'll be the only thing we ever look for. And we won't believe people when they tell us their stories, when they don't look like this, right? So we've got to change the narrative to be more inclusive of other identities, other lived experiences, other ways of identifying this. And not only is it important for us to get these images out of our heads, but it's also important for the victims themselves to get them out of their heads, because they don't know that they're being trafficked. If we can change the common narrative about what trafficking is, if we can help to inform the victims and survivors that we work alongside about what trafficking is and how it shows up and how much more common it is than we think, then they will be able to self-identify. They will be able to know who and how to ask for help, because as of right now, they usually don't. We also, as advocates and people working with survivors of violence, need to really check our bias. Working on this issue of human trafficking means really asking yourself and others that you work alongside to care about people who are often perceived as unworthy and rarely considered victims. People who engage in sex work, people who are undocumented, people who are experiencing homelessness, kids who run away from home a lot, people who use drugs. We tend to judge individuals based on their choices instead of thinking about why they're making the choices that they are, or even considering that even though they're making choices that we don't agree with, that they still deserve access to their basic human rights. No one deserves to be exploited, even if they've made choices that we don't like, right? And if we don't care about these individuals who are part of these stigmatized identities on the right side of your screen, then we will be missing most of the trafficking cases, because traffickers are targeting individuals that have these identities on the right side of the screen. They're counting on us not to care. They're counting on us to judge. We hear things like treat 'em and street 'em, or frequent flyers, looking to draining our resources, those kinds of situations. We turn people away, right? When we're turning individuals who have these stigmatized identities away, we're sending them right back to their traffickers. Traffickers continue to operate with impunity. So I urge you to think about why people might be engaging in sex work, why people might be using substances. In many cases, they're being forced to. In many cases, They have developed an addiction because they were forced to use drugs. And now they're continuing to use it as a coping mechanism for all of the trauma that they've experienced, right? People stay on the street, not because they like the street, but because shelters are dangerous for them, especially if they are trans or a certain gender or a certain age or what have you, different in any way, right? So really think about the populations that you're serving. Now, this next slide about trauma, I'm not going to spend too much time here because most of you already work heavily in this intersection of trauma, right? So what I'll just reiterate is that 70 to 90% of trafficking survivors have experienced prior trauma. The prior trauma is being used as a mechanism for control, right? The fear of additional trauma, the fear of hurting a family member. And then there's all of the additional trauma of being bought and sold, not being paid for their labor, being lied to, being frauded, right? When people experience this level of complex trauma, their brain chemistry changes. Again, I know that you know this, I'm just sort of doing a review here, but the individuals who have been trafficked, who've experienced this level of trauma, they don't come running into our facility saying, help me, I'm a victim of trafficking. It's just not how it works. They're ashamed or embarrassed of what's happened to them. They've got a sense of duty or loyalty to their trafficker because it's their mom, you know, or the love of their life as far as they're concerned, or the only person who gave them housing when no one else would. There's fear, obviously, and they've developed a mistrust of institutions or law enforcement because in many cases, they've been criminalized for crimes they've been forced to commit as a result of their trafficking, or they've been stigmatized or blamed for their victimization. And so when they show up in your facilities, they refuse services, they show no emotional reactions, they're often uninterested in cooperating with law enforcement. In some cases, they're irritable and uncooperative. You know, I would be too, if this was my lived experience. And that makes it really that much harder for you to identify and to find your empathy, right? I want to just, you know, I want to be there with you in that, right? It's hard to find your empathy for someone who is yelling at you, right? Or who is showing their trauma to you, right? Or who says they don't want your help, or who says they don't trust law enforcement. It's a challenge that we all have to try to overcome. In addition to the trauma, we see language barriers. That might be the English language, but it also could be somebody with cognitive delay or another disability that renders them unable to communicate. So we see language barriers. We see people who don't know their rights. They don't understand they've been trafficked. They don't know that our labor laws protect them, regardless of immigration status. They've been lied to. They've been told they're useless, nobody cares, and if they dare report this, they're going to get arrested, right? They've been socially or physically isolated. They've been brought away from their communities. They've been told, again, if you tell anyone, you're the one who's going to get in trouble. So most survivors are not going to ask for help. Now, I also want to highlight some of these additional intersections. So we see people, especially young people who identify as LGBTQ, disproportionately represented in survivor populations because of the increased risk of trauma and the increased risk of homelessness for these populations. Here in Colorado, about 40% of homeless youth identify as LGBTQ. 40%. That's significantly disproportionate to the population, which is about 10%, right? And that's because of the increased risk of trauma and increased risk of being thrown out of their home or running away from the people in their home who are perpetrating that violence. We also know on the other side that they're less likely to access resources for fear of, again, being stigmatized or not being allowed access to those resources. Individuals with disability are also often targeted. So think about this in terms of disability, but also think about this in terms of intimate partner violence. The traffickers in these cases are often the victim's caretaker. So the caretaker is stealing their public benefits, their SSI or SSDI benefits, and in many cases then forcing them to work in either sex or labor, sometimes forcing them to beg, sometimes forcing them to sell drugs, sometimes forcing them to sell sex, right? Since they're so dependent on their caretaker, the caretakers take advantage of this dependency. Obviously, there's the potentiality for difficulties with communication or speech. A lot of individuals with disabilities may be sheltered or isolated and really craving relationships. So we also see these individuals targeted online. So their caretaker isn't trafficking them, but they meet someone online who says, I love you, I want to take care of you, I want to be your caretaker, leave your family, come live with me, we'll be in love, I'll take care of you. And then they are then trafficked. Again, their SSI or SSDI benefits are taken, and then they're sold for sex or labor. When it comes to domestic violence and sex assault, I hope that I've already highlighted this intersection enough for you, but I just wanted to be more clear that we see sex assault as part of labor trafficking situations 30% of the time. 30% of labor trafficking cases involve some kind of sexual violence used as a form of physical force. Not only can domestic violence be used as a push factor, pushing someone out of a home into precarity, but also it's used as a form of compliance embedded at the beginning of relationships. I looked into our data, cases involving servile marriage, forced smuggling, forced drug trafficking, forced pimping, and lots of cases of forced domestic servitude have involved domestic violence. Obviously, it's more than just physical violence, but yeah, as domestic violence advocates, you know that. And as a note, human trafficking is more likely to exploit men and boys than domestic violence is, and so we just have to be aware of that discrepancy. Okay, so red flags. This is a tough one, right? People are not going to come in self-identifying. And often these red flags are going to be overlapping with other forms of violence. So it's important to have the context of this conversation in addition to lists of red flags. I'm going to provide you with additional resources outside of just this slide deck for longer lists of red flags to be looking for. That also contains screening questions that you could potentially add to your screener, right? When you're doing your intake. I don't expect you to only be screening for trafficking, but you can add a couple of questions into your screener that are, if someone answers yes to, you could have additional questions on the side for that. And we're going to provide you with all of those resources. So think about these red flags as sort of a constellation. You know, once you start to see 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 of these red flags showing up, that's when you want your human trafficking protocol to kick in. And you do want to develop a human trafficking protocol, right? You do want to have an idea of what you should be doing if trafficking does show up. Likely, you can support the basic needs of that individual in the short term, but it's also likely that you'll need additional resources. So we see a lot of unexplained injuries or injuries in multiple stages of healing. We see a lot of evidence of prolonged infection or time since injury. So healthcare was being withheld. They didn't want the victim to have contact with a healthcare provider, so they waited until it was really bad. And now the infection is really bad, or there was a break that happened that never healed properly, that kind of thing. We see a lot of malnourishment. Food, water, and sleep is being withheld. So it's like, you know, you don't get any food until you do X, Y, Z. You don't get to take a break until you do X, Y, Z, right? Signs of malnourishment are generally poor health. We see a lot of frequent or repeated STIs, a lot of frequent or repeated pregnancies and abortions. We sometimes see branding. That would be usually in a pimp-controlled situation where the pimp would brand their victims with the pimp's street name and date of initiation or street name of the victim, or sometimes dollar signs. Queens, crowns are really common. We see card suits like hearts, diamonds, clubs, spades, sometimes more egregious like sexualized tattoos. Not always, obviously not everyone with the tattoo is being trafficked, but again, you want to be thinking, you want to be kind of collecting red flags. good way to find out if somebody's tattoo is something they got voluntarily or not is to just ask them about it in a non-assuming way. Like, I like your tattoo, tell me about it, right? If somebody looks at the floor and says, I can't remember, or I just liked it, that's a pretty big red flag, because a lot of us do have tattoos, right? But we can usually explain them. Even if we're embarrassed about what happened, we can usually say, yeah, I got that tattoo when I was 18 and stupid and I did this thing or whatever, right? We can talk about our tattoos. It usually doesn't cause us to go into, to get triggered, right? So in that situation, it might. Evidence of sexual trauma, a lot of substance misuse. Remember, people are using lack of sleep, lack of food or water, and they're mixing that with substance use to control someone. When someone is high and exhausted and hurt and hungry, they are less likely to run. But even if they did run, they're less likely to be believed, right? Drug users are thought of as unreliable, making bad choices, liars in our society. And so traffickers are using drugs to make it less likely for someone to identify a trafficking victim. Okay, so behaviorally, you might get someone, excuse me, who doesn't know where they're at. They can't articulate to you where they slept last night, where they live, where they're coming from, where they're going to. Maybe they only know they're in Colorado because they see the mountains and they're just guessing, right? Something like that. A lot of inconsistencies. Remember, most of the time people are being trafficked by someone that they know or love. So they might be lying to protect their trafficker because they love their trafficker, or they're lying to protect themselves because they've been told by their trafficker that they're going to get arrested for crimes that they were forced to commit, including prostitution. So they're lying to you to protect themselves from arrest because they don't know that they're protected by our laws. Or they're not lying at all. They're just so traumatized and maybe high that they're remembering things in a nonlinear way. They're not able to tell you the whole story. And remember, that's by design. Traffickers are hoping that they won't be able to tell you the whole story, or that when they tell you the story, that it'll sound like a lie so that they can continue to get away with it. So if you have someone that's claiming to speak on behalf of someone else, that's a big red flag. Remember, traffickers are often trafficked by someone in their family. So it might be someone who looks just like them. It might be someone who speaks their native language and says, I'll interpret for you, no need to get an interpreter, that kind of thing. Just remember, it's so vital to always be able to separate people out, to have an interpreter, even if it takes a while. Don't use family as interpreters. So important. I really highly recommend downloading a good app. There are so many good apps these days that you can use for interpretation, not for your full intake, but in the meantime, while you're waiting for somebody to come and help you interpret, you could have an app where you can communicate with the person. You're not in any trouble. We're not calling law enforcement. We just want to make sure you're safe. Do you need some food? Do you want a blanket, right? Allow you to be able to start to build a connection with that individual, start building some trust with them, let them know that you care and that you just want to make sure that they're heard. Someone who doesn't have their ID, or where someone else has their ID, that's another big red flag. We often see identification confiscated by the trafficker because it's another form of like a power dynamic, right? If I have your ID, you can't leave. Someone who's trying to pay in cash. I don't know if that applies to most of you, but someone who tries to pay for like a healthcare visit with cash, that's a big red flag. They're just trying to not leave a paper trail, that kind of thing. Or tries to use like a prepaid Visa card, that's another red flag. From a mental health perspective, we're looking for PTSD. So any kind of trauma symptoms, memory loss, disassociation, paranoia is really common. Often, they're not going to be immediately trusting you, which makes it really hard to help them. But just always remember that paranoia is a really normal trauma response. And just because someone is super paranoid doesn't mean they're lying. And doesn't mean that they're making it all up. It often just means that they've been traumatized. We see a lot of sleep deprivation mixed with substance use, which can lead to memory loss and psychosis. And we see a lot of co-occurring mental health and substance related disorders. So the rest of my slides are meant to be some resources for you. I plan on leaving maybe like 7 to 8 minutes for questions. So if you do have questions, think about populating those into the chat. And I want to give you as many resources as I can. So first of all, there is a Colorado Human Trafficking Hotline, if you didn't know. It's been around since 2007. The Laboratory to Combat Human Trafficking we have managed it since 2013, so about 10 years. We receive about 1,000 calls or texts per year. So about a third of our calls come in from survivors. So of course we want you to give this number out to people. But in many cases, people aren't ready to call on their own or are too scared to call on their own. And in some cases, they may want you to call for them as advocates. So you can do that. We are also a resource for you. Now, if you call and you're an advocate for someone else, tell us that. Say, I'm an advocate, I work at so-and-so shelter or what have you, and I'm calling on behalf of a client who disclosed a situation that we think may be trafficking. And these are the resources that we need, right? You're probably providing shelter for the night, but you're not going to be able to house them forever. And they need additional mental health resources, or they need something else. I mean, people have varied needs. What you want to do is call the hotline, let us know who you are, and we're going to ask really minimal questions. We don't do a full-on intake on the hotline because we're a tip and referral hotline. So mostly what we need to know is the age of the victim, the gender, and what their needs are. A lot of individuals have legal needs. They're too scared to report to law enforcement, but they do need a lawyer. They need to get their IDs back. They need to get their kids back. They need to make sure that they're not going to get deported when they report. They need legal help. So we can connect them to that legal help that's specific to trafficking. We can connect them to mental health resources that are specific to trafficking. There's transportation, there's some housing resources out there. If you can house someone temporarily for 2 or 3 weeks, we might be able to connect you to long-term housing specifically for trafficking survivors on the hotline. So use us as a resource. Now, we're a tip and referral hotline, meaning we do take tips also. So we are not mandatory reporters for adults, but we are for kids. So if you're calling in for someone under the age of 18, we are mandated to report that. Just know that, just as you might be. But for 18 or over, we allow them the autonomy of deciding whether or not they want to pursue justice through the criminal justice system. If they do, great. We would report that to our trusted and trained law enforcement professionals. We are not calling random non-emergency phone numbers. We are calling the cell phones of individuals who we know have been trained on the nuances of this crime, who will respond in a trauma-informed way. So you can access those trauma-informed law enforcement officers across the state of Colorado, not just in Denver, by calling this hotline. We won't give you their cell phone numbers, we'll call them for you, but we have a process to do that quickly if it's an emergency, or within a day if it's not an emergency situation. Or we can give you some of our trusted and trained referral numbers. We can make warm handoffs if people aren't able to take down phone numbers in that moment. Please, please, please use us as a resource. And the last thing I'll say about the hotline is we're always looking for new resources. So you should know that a lot of our resources are domestic violence and sexual assault and other interpersonal violence service providers who can support the varied needs of trafficking survivors, because we don't have that many trafficking specific resources in Colorado just yet. We're working on it, but a lot of our resources are in this intersection. What you're looking at here are some of our statewide resources and organizations that have trafficking specific either programming, or their entire organization is trafficking specific. So Asia Pacific Development Center, Colorado Coalition for the Homeless, Colorado Legal Services, COVA, El Centro, Rocky Mountain Immigrant Advocacy Network, Servicio de la Raza, TESA, Voluntad. These are all organizations that have specific human trafficking resources and can often offer those to people across the state, or can assist us in getting people into the greater Denver area to access those resources, whatever they prefer. I also want to acknowledge that a lot of the hesitancy of domestic violence or sexual assault providers is around funding and just the fact that it's so limited. I want you to know that there are lots of organizations, the Laboratory to Combat Human Trafficking is one of them, who are willing to partner with you to build your capacity. We offer these trainings for free. We do much deeper dives into specific safety planning or harm reduction, stuff that you can use with individuals. We can offer consultation on building, protocol, or guidelines for your existing organization. All of it's free. We are a nonprofit. We want to partner with individuals. We want to help build your capacity. We also might partner with you for funding if you apply for a grant, and we could be a sub-grantee or something like that. Know that a lot of existing funding that a lot of the organizations on this call are already receiving, like VOCA funds or VAWA funds, already include human trafficking in their definition of victims. And therefore, your organizations receiving those fundings can support victims of trafficking with your current funding without actually changing anything, but just acknowledging that you're already likely seeing this and might be already receiving funding to support these individuals. And they also, many of these, VOCA, VAWA, other federal grants, have existing grants within this intersection that you can apply for to help you to support individuals who exist in this intersection. There's also flex funding that we're hoping continues to expand, where you can get a little bit creative about how you might house survivors of trafficking with hotel vouchers or other flex funding that the federal government is giving out. We're hoping that that continues, and that can be used for survivors of human trafficking as well. The last little bit I want to show you about here is on harm reduction. For those of you who are case managers or advocates who are working with individuals who you're realizing may have experienced trafficking, we encourage you to practice harm reduction with those individuals, practice safety planning with those individuals. You might, a safety plan might include run plans for youth who are running, safe ways to use substances, safe work or employment practices, just basically knowing their rights, and then ways to stay safe online, especially for young people. There are, many tools out there that can help you with this. I realize that we don't have time for a huge harm reduction, safety planning conversation right now, but I just wanted you to know that there are lots of tools out there that can help to support your continued learning in this space. You're likely already doing a lot of this. Safety plans are useful to prepare for the possibility of violence. They can be used and integrated into various trafficking stages while they're still in this situation, while they're in the process of leaving their trafficker, and once they have left. Everyone is going to be individualized. And really what we're talking about is removing barriers to receive support and safety. So if traffickers are meeting the basic needs of survivors, then we're going to have to start meeting those basic needs if they are going to ever be able to leave their traffickers. So it's simple stuff, it's all the same basic needs that everyone has, in addition to, additional mental health or survivor mentorship or other resources that they might need. I wanted to show you this bit here. If you are dealing with someone who may still be engaging in sex work and you're afraid for their safety while engaging in sex work, these are just some examples of how to have these conversations around harm reduction with individuals who are engaging in sex work. If this is beyond your scope or it's outside of your ethical concern, I get it. I'm not saying you have to do this, but I just wanted you to give you sort of an example idea of what kind of conversation we might have with someone who is still engaging in sex work to meet their survival needs. Because we want to make sure that they're safe. We want to make sure they survive while they're doing it. So we talk about working in pairs or pretending to be working in pairs, negotiating condom use, staying sober while working, taking pictures of license plates while working with their cell phones. We talk about wearing clothes that you can run in, never talking about your personal situation, because traffickers or potential traffickers can use knowledge of your personal situation, your family, your children, your private life to coerce you into trafficking situations, those kinds of things. So again, I know we don't have time for a big harm reduction training here, but I just wanted to give you an idea of what this might look like. So that's what I've got. I'm going to stop sharing my screen here. and maybe open up the chat. Let's see, for any questions that have come in. Yes, I know you're getting a copy of the slides. The average age of trafficking victims. Yeah, thank you for answering that, Christina. My colleague Christina already sort of answered it. But yes, we've had survivors who are even younger than 8. We've had kids who were sold at very young ages. I mean, so it's pretty egregious. I don't even want to, I don't want to give you vicarious trauma by telling you how young, but it's all ages. 25% of cases are minors, 75% are adults. That's a good way to give you an idea of the ages, but there's no real average age because people are trafficked in such a diversity of experiences, you know, in labor and in sex and in so many different sectors of labor. Yeah, I would say, Sabrina, that it's likely not 7 years old. No, I'm just going to say it's not 7 years old. So it's just not. The most of the survivors that we meet are in their youth, but they're adults, like 18 to 25 is more of like a realistic age range when it comes to sex trafficking situations. And then when it's labor trafficking, it's older than that even. It's really just vulnerable people. So I mean, there's just not great data on this. What we have is data on the perpetrators and less data on the victims, actually. But yeah, that a list of types of businesses that are more likely to engage. Yeah, that's a really good question. I'm just gonna really quickly, I'm gonna put our post training survey link into the chat while I'm answering these questions. So I put the pre-training survey link into the chat. Now I'm putting the post-training survey link into the chat. We hope that you'll take both surveys to help us to improve our trainings. So I just wanted to say that. Okay, so Danny, types of businesses. I mentioned the sectors, right? So we're talking about agriculture, ranching, restaurants and hospitality, landscaping, domestic work. Those are like the big ones. Construction, I can't remember if I said that. So those are the big ones where we see it. Yeah, that is not done in Colorado. So Linda, you know, that everyone in the hospitality industry in Florida is required to do a trafficking training. That is not required in Colorado. So we're working on it. We provide these trainings to folks in the hospitality industries, but they have to take them voluntarily, and therefore they usually don't. So a lot of the folks working in these industries are not trained on this. Now, I don't want to make it seem like everyone in the agricultural industry or everyone in the construction industry is trafficking anyone. Of course they're not, right? Most businesses are not trafficking people, but those are the types of businesses, those are the sectors that we see it in. And then, you know, what you want to be looking for is people that are using a lot of like immigrant labor, people who are using a lot of subcontractors, because often they're sort of hiding the fact that people are being trafficked because they're paying the subcontractors, but they're not taking accountability of whether or not the people who are working for the subcontractors are getting paid. So that can be a red flag. Anywhere where people live with their employer or the employer provides housing, that's a lot of power for somebody to have, housing and employment. So we see that being taken advantage of. But I wouldn't say like you can just like walk by a business and recognize this. It really does take, you know, like having conversations with individuals who are working there or really paying attention. Like if you notice someone being abused while, or being yelled at or demeaned while working, not being allowed to take breaks, anyone who complains of not being paid what they were promised, anyone who complains of abuse, but it's really challenging to be able to spot this from the outside. So I do have additional like red flag links and stuff that I'll send you with, but nothing that I could cover like in the next 2 minutes. So I'll kind of leave this. Okay, so an issue that I'm running into is that detectives won't necessarily focus on high-risk victims because the individuals now have an open case, just constant runaways, word of mouth. Do you have any recommendations for services that can be offered for individuals who may not have open cases? Yeah, I mean, so most of the time, like mostly individuals don't want to report to law enforcement. Some do, right? We saw the numbers of all of that, but most don't. All of the resources that we have in our resource directory will support anyone who's experienced trafficking. It doesn't matter if they have an open case. So I hope that's helpful. So it's like, if the person doesn't self-identify and they are absolutely like, I am not being trafficked, like you're crazy, I don't want your help, that's going to be a different challenge, right? We're not going to be able to support someone who doesn't want our help. That's really hard. We can't force someone into services, right? But if somebody needs help, but they don't have an open case, no problem. Any of the resources that we're talking about will support that individual. Colorado Legal Services, anyone, all they have to do is an intake. They'll have to do an intake with these organizations to make sure that they, quote, qualify, meaning make sure they've experienced trafficking. But once that intake is done, especially if they have a case manager, they won't have to do another intake, and they'll qualify for all of the resources that are out there to support those individuals. Does that answer your question, Alexis? I hope. Okay, good. Well, we're at 11:30, so I guess I'll stop talking now, but I just want to say thank you for your time. I don't know, Sierra, should I try to answer this last question, or should I let everyone go?
We will share your information, Kara, with the question that's in the chat. Just want to be aware of our time with our interpreter. So thank you all. If you have any questions, feel free to continue to put them in the chat. We'll make sure you get in contact with Kara. So thank you all so much for being here. Excellent presentation, Kara. I took a lot of notes myself. Appreciate everyone for being here. If you all will fill out those surveys. Just a few reminders here. We will send a follow-up email with survey links, and the recording of this will be up on CCASA's YouTube page. So thank you all so much for joining us today. We will see you all soon. Have a good day, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.